evening. My name is Salman Jilani, and I'm part of the UK MSA. I would like to begin tonight's event with the recitation of the Holy Quran, the first chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening. I will recite it, and then I will translate it. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. And the chapter begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. All praises and thanks to Allah, the Lord of the worlds, the most beneficent, the most merciful, the only owner of the Day of Judgment. You alone we worship, and in you alone we seek help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, and not those who have earned your anger, and those who have gone astray. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. And now I would like to invite Brother Hamza Quraishi, the President of the UK MSA, to come up. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Thank you all for coming to this very important event. The MSA has worked extremely hard to put this together along with the Islamic Society of Central Kentucky. Sharia is something that is talked about a lot in the news, but is not really understood fully by either non-Muslims or Muslims. Sharia is basically the way Muslims try to live their life. And unfortunately, because of the lack of education on this subject, there has been a big anti-Sharia movement in America. There are currently 4 states that implement a Sharia law ban, and 18 other states considering a similar ban. And that is according to a 2011 study by CARE Chicago. Recently, a similar bill was introduced to the Kentucky State Legislature from a representative from Harrodsburg. We aim tonight to clarify the misconceptions about this concept and educate the public as a whole by way of our 4 main objectives. 1, what is Sharia, and do Muslims want to implement Sharia law in America? Is Sharia law oppressive to women? Is Sharia law inhumane? And finally, how can Muslims and non-Muslims respond to Islamophobic sentiment in general? With that being said, I want to welcome our Vice President, Qasim Abdallah, to the stage to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome. My name is Qasim Abdallah and I am the Vice President of the UK Muslim Student Association, and I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bagby. Dr. Bagby obtained his PhD from the University of Michigan in Near Eastern Studies in 1986 with specialty in Islamic law. His research for the last 10 years has focused on Muslims in America. In 2001, he published the results of the first comprehensive study of mosques in America entitled The Mosques in America, A National Portrait. And recently, in 2011, he published another work entitled The American Mosque. Dr. Bagby is currently a professor of Islamic studies here at UK, and not only is Dr. Bagby an accomplished professional, he is integral to the success of the MSA because of the support and help and guidance he gives us as our faculty advisor. And please help me welcome Dr. Bagby to the stage.
Since everybody's saying Assalamu alaikum, everybody must know that, right? So let me say Assalamu alaikum. May God's peace and blessings be upon you. And I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the merciful. And I send prayers and blessings on our beloved Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. I welcome you. And I really thank the MSA. Boy, let's give a hand to the MSA for putting this together. Thank you. It's such a wonderful crowd. I'm to speak just for a few minutes to give context to our main subject, which is Sharia law. But we're talking about, in a sense, the issue of Sharia in America. So who is the American Muslim community? And so in 25 words or less, I'm going to give you, a 100-year history, right? To give you a sense of what this American Muslim community is and what they're all about. Let me just start by saying that Islam is actually old here in America. Islam has been here since the very beginning. At least 10% of all Africans enslaved and brought to this country were Muslim, largely from the Senegambia area. And their legacy is actually felt very much. The banjo is from Senegambia. The blues is from Senegambia. Rice, the technology of rice cultivation, that's why they were brought here, by the way, because rice growers wanted people who knew the culture of cultivating rice. And I could keep on, that's a whole lecture by itself. So they were very much a part of the American story. By the third generation, though, they had converted. So by the third generation, the Islamic part of their identity disappears. And Islam disappears for a time. At the turn of the century, of course, now I have to think now, see, I'm old, right? Turn of the century meant 1900s, not 2000, right? Not the millennium. So at the turn of the century, the 1900s, the 20th century, immigrants started coming here from the Muslim world. And they continued up until about the 20s. In 1924, the American government passed a law that basically stopped all immigration from kind of non-white areas of the world. The doors of immigration were open to Eastern Europeans only. And so that immigration from the Muslim world basically stopped in mid-1920s. And again, by about the third generation of those immigrants that came over, Islam had been largely lost. People had assimilated, people had converted, and the effect of Islam was minimal. Now, what happens in the 60s is really tied to our story, because the doors of immigration were reopened in America in 1965. And also, the newly independent Muslim states started to send over students to study here, and they're still here, by the way. So the two things, immigration and also students, started coming in large numbers, starting in the 60s and then exponentially increasing every decade. The other thing that happened was that African Americans started converting to Islam, 50s, but definitely by the 60s in large numbers, and in the 70s in large numbers. African Americans were drawn to the emphasis in Islam on uplift of the individual, uplift of people, the moral and discipline that was ingrained in Islam, and also the social justice message of Islam. This appealed to a lot of African Americans, and they converted. And so Islam in America is unique, one, because we have immigration from all over the Muslim world. But the second is that in America, unlike European countries, unlike any other Western country, we have a large percentage of indigenous people, people who, are from the land who have converted. And so the numbers of Muslims really grows from the 60s. There were about 100 mosques in America in about 1960. When I counted the mosque in 1990, there was about 900. In 2000, I counted 1,200. In well, just this past 2010, I counted 2,100. So you can see the numbers of mosques, indication of the size of the community has grown greatly. About the 1980s, the Muslim community here in America slowly but decisively embraced the idea that they were going to be wholly Muslim and wholly American at the same time, that they would embrace that dual identity. They did not want to embrace an assimilationist understanding of Islam, whereby Islam would be modified so it might fit into America. The Muslims that came did not want to give up their Islam. They wanted to live out their Islam. And by the 80s, this idea developed that we're going to strongly hold on to our Islam, but at the same time, we're going to embrace this identity of being American. And so the idea of being an American Muslim, of being loyal to both, kind of develops. Really, you can see the development in the 80s, and it really has now become the kind of the culture of Islam in America. A man named James Hunter, who is a noted scholar, University of Virginia, he wrote a book on culture wars. That's the title of his book, Culture Wars. And he argued in an article not so long ago, and I think he was thinking of Muslims when he made this argument. He said, new immigrants to America, new groups of new ethnic groups, new religions that come to America go through 4 different phases, hopefully 4, but 4 phases. One is invisibility. America does not see. And for Muslims have largely been invisible, definitely up to the 80s. Muslims were basically invisible. Americans didn't know about the American Muslim population. America became aware of Islam, especially starting in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Americans started becoming aware of Islam, but they were not aware of that, there is in America Islam. It's really not until the 90s that things start to change. And that's his second stage after invisibility is recognition. And what that means is simply that, okay, there's a presence, and okay, that's okay, they're there. No value put to it. Just a sense that, okay, we have amongst us these people, and they're not a part of us, right? A recognition of an other in our presence. He said the third phase is negotiation or contestation. And that's when the ethnic group or religious group starts desiring a seat at the table, starts wanting to appropriate the identity of the larger society. And that's what happened to American Muslim society. Starts saying, we are American, you need to accept us. Accept us as we are. We're not going to change, but we are going to embrace the ideals of America and what it means to be American. And so, starting in the 90s, you start to see this. You start to see this contestation of, okay, are you really American? And we're in this phase right now. And of course, since 9/11, the pace and the fervor and the debate is as hot as ever. I've been Muslim since, 1969. I've never seen in America such an atmosphere of hate directed at Muslims. Partly, again, because we were invisible. Now the Muslim community is not invisible, and there are people coming out of the woodworks who, one, because they feel that Muslims are not part of the tradition of this country and therefore have no place in this country. Some people don't feel that Muslims are the right color and therefore have no place in this country. Some people feel that Muslims believe in a faith that contradicts the religion of this country and therefore have no place in this country. And there are some people who believe that if Muslims become an influential voice in America, it will change foreign policy, and they don't want that to happen, so therefore the Muslim community has to be continually marginalized so that they have no influence whatsoever, that nobody hears their voice. And so anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic rhetoric and attacks have increased greatly, especially since 9/11. And I must say just very quickly that, 9/11 was a wake-up call to everybody, to Muslims, that there are hateful people who call themselves Muslims and embrace Islam that do terrible things here in this country. Muslims started their organizations that would try to interface with American society in the 90s. All the organizations that we know, like Muslims know these names, like CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, Muslim Political Action Council, and all those things, they were all started in the 90s. And when 9/11 happened, they were all new organizations, and nobody listened to them. In fact, every American Muslim organization in this country condemned the attacks of 9/11, but our community was still relatively, unknown, invisible, and therefore nobody heard it, our community. And that's changing now. But the point is simply that our community, the Muslim community, has come under such great attack, and I don't really want to go into all the details, but one of the avenues of attack is Sharia law. And that gives me a chance to get off this stage and hand it over to hand the baton to the next person. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Iman Qureshi, and I'm the ICK rep. I just had to thank Dr. Bagby for that, and I just had a couple of things to say before dinner. I would like to remind everyone that all the food is halal thanks to Alibaba and UK Dining. And to make this a little easier, we're going to have the front half of the room get food first, and then we'll dismiss the back half soon. And I hope everyone enjoys the food.
Student Association here at UK. How is everyone doing tonight? Good, alhamdulillah. I see a couple of nods. I see some concentration on your food, which is good. I'm glad you guys like the dinner. If you're wondering, and I'm sure you are, the UK MSA right now is doing fantastic, alhamdulillah, and it's almost entirely because of our next speaker, Sheikh Abdul Nasir Jangda. Let me talk about him a little bit before he comes up here. He was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. At the age of 10, he went to Karachi, Pakistan to memorize the Quran. There he managed to commit the entire Quran to memory in less than 1 year. He completed a BA and MA in Arabic from Karachi University and also obtained a Master's in Islamic Studies from the University of Sindh. He taught Arabic at the University of Texas at Arlington from 2005 to 2007 and has served as an instructor and advisor to various Islamic schools. He is currently an instructor with the Bayan Institute and Kalam Institute, which both you guys could find online if you're interested. And he does all of this while traveling the country and being the incredibly awesome speaker that he is, mashallah. I'd like to remind you guys that we do have note cards in the middle of all of your tables. Please take advantage of this opportunity to ask any questions that you may have pertaining to Islam. You guys have a wonderful, credible source here who knows a lot about this topic. We'll be coming around midway throughout the talk picking them up. So go ahead and start asking your questions on the note cards. Also, another favor, if you guys could give him your utmost attention, so to the point where he goes back to Dallas knowing that the University of Kentucky is the best that he's ever visited, which, guys, let's be honest, we're pretty great, right? So it won't be too hard. So with that, please give a warm welcome and a round of applause to Sheikh Abdul Nasir Jangda. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I begin by praising God Almighty and sending His peace and blessings upon His chosen and select messengers, ending with the finality of prophethood, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The topic today is Shariah. And Sharia law has been the topic of conversation over the past even couple of years, quite intensively. And you know what, Dr. Bagby, which again, you know, I just wanted to mention what a great resource Dr. Bagby is. I was really excited to come here to UK because I knew that I would get the opportunity to meet him and hear from him. And it was really profound what he was sharing with us before dinner. When Dr. Bagby talked about the different phases that a community goes through, it's very, very accurate. And this topic is a demonstration of that same theory playing out. The invisibility, moving on to recognition, and then contestation and negotiation, and we see exactly that. There was a time in America where, forget about Sharia, just like as Dr. Bagby mentioned about Islam and Muslims were invisible here. And so the topic of Sharia was a non-topic. And I remember where the word was just like any other Arabic word. And then eventually we had some recognition of exactly, or maybe just a term in and of itself, and now we're at the table having a discussion about the implications of this word, and the implications of this term, and what it represents, and what it presents, and what the outcome or the possibilities are because of this word. So I don't want to get into too much detail, and one thing that needs to be said here is, and I'd like to define the word and then I'll explain a little bit about the concept itself. The word Sharia in its linguistic roots comes from the root word which means a beginning or an opening of something. And it's used different derivatives. The Arabic language, I try to explain to students in seminars and classes that I teach, the Arabic language is a very interesting and beautiful language. In the Arabic language, every single word has a root. And that root has a meaning, has an implication. And what happens from there is that the Arabic language is a language of patterns. You have various different patterns, and you take that root and you mold it and stretch it and bend it and flex it and make it fit onto or into these different patterns. And depending on what pattern you put it onto, it'll develop a subtlety. You know, the best example I can give to you is if you have red colored Play-Doh, then it doesn't matter if it's a square or it's a circle or it's a triangle, it'll be in different shapes, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be the color red. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, that's why my example is Play-Doh, all right? I realize it's a university and academic institution, right? But my example is Play-Doh, all right? Because I probably have Play-Doh in my pockets right now somewhere. But that's what happens when you have babies at home. So that's how the Arabic language works. And so the root of this word, it means the beginning of something, or the opening, an opening that is very broad. And from there we have a lot of very interesting derivatives. The word for a street or a path, a road, comes from the same word, Shariah, Shawariah. The word for the word for the opening of a watering station, or a watering hole, what they would call in the olden days, right, was also called mashra, something that leads to water. So when you would kind of veer off the path and you would stop over, like at a rest area, which is a very appropriate example, a rest area, that comes from this same root and this same word as well. And there are so many other derivatives that come from this. But the term for legislating something, putting something down in law, providing structure, legal structure, and governance to something also comes from this word, tashri'ah. And so what's very interesting then is, from the Arabic linguistic classical, the etymological perspective, the etymology of this word Shariah is that in its essence, it basically refers to something that leads to the fulfillment of the needs of people. Something that leads to the fulfillment of the basic needs of a people, of a society, of a community, of a civilization. And that's what it refers to. This word was adopted in the sacred scripture that Muslims hold very sacredly, the Quran, which we believe to be the exact word of God. And in that, God talked about the prophetic tradition. And realize that a lot of times as Muslims, when we talk about a prophetic tradition, as Muslims we have to be cautious and careful, or at least mindful of this. And for non-Muslims, it might interest them to know that the Quran, when we say the prophetic tradition, we're not only just talking about the Prophet Muhammad, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, in the Quran, He says, شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا. That God has ordained, has put down a structure, has provided a system within which you can meet your needs and you can live a meaningful existence. The same type of structure that was provided to the Prophet Noah. شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ. And it is the same exact structure that we have divinely inspired to you. وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ وَمَا وَصَّيْنَا بِهِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى وَعِيسَى. And it is the same exact type of structure, way of life, structure to one's existence that was granted to the Prophet Abraham, the Prophet Moses, and the Prophet Isa, peace and blessings be upon them. أَنْ أَقِيمُوا الدِّينَ وَلَا تَتَفَرَّقُوا فِيهِ. That you establish this way of life that God has ordained for you, and you do not differ and break away from one another. But so one of the points that I wanted to make here specifically is that it is our belief and perspective that every single prophet came with a Shariah. And that what that means is having some direction in life, knowing how to live your life, finding some direction and guidance in your life, and thereby by means of that, having purpose and meaning and fulfillment to your existence. And that's something very logical. We all understand that. We all understand that. So when we go and we look for direction, when we look for meaning and purpose in life, that is exactly what the Sharia what its purpose is within the life of Muslims, is to give us structure and to give us direction and give us meaning and purpose within our existence. And it is the manifestation or the practical realization, the daily practical realization of the actual objective of our existence. As Muslims, we believe that the objective, the goal of our existence, the goal and the purpose of our lives, that if this is achieved, or at least if we live our lives in the pursuit of this goal, this objective, then we deem ourselves, or we deem someone in that position to be successful. That person has achieved the purpose of their life. That person has lived a successful, meaningful existence. And that goal, that objective that we are in pursuit of is the pleasure of God. It's a relationship with Allah. It is to understand who we were created by, and to live a life that would be pleasing to Him. And that is our primary objective and goal. The daily practical manifestation and realization of that is what is called Shariah, but that is not the goal. And that needs to be understood. Many Islamic philosophers, Imam Ghazali for instance, has talked about this. And Imam Ghazali is someone that I encourage Muslims and even non-Muslims to read about. That he lived at a time, and he himself was a professor, probably one of the most knowledgeable people at his time when it came to Sharia, when it came to Islamic legal theory. And he grappled and struggled with the fact that it seemed like the means was becoming the goal, and was becoming the objective, was becoming the end. But it was a means to an end, and the end was this very powerful, life-altering, and this meaningful, conscious decision, the relationship with God that would guide one through one's life. And that guidance and that practical realization, manifestation would be Sharia. And that's what it refers to. So now to understand, after defining what the term is and what it means to us, even in the Islamic, from the Islamic perspective, then to explain maybe what are some of the moving parts and mechanisms within Sharia. So Sharia is a very interesting concept to us as Muslims, and I think it would also be a very intriguing study to non-Muslims as well, because Sharia is a combination of what we would call the naql and the aql. Sharia is a combination of divine or prophetic injunction combined with human intellect, social factors. It is a combination of those two things. That we have divine injunctions, we have prophetic instruction, and then that is formulated, and that is tempered, and then that is applied through observation and human intellect. And the result of that, the consequence of that, is what is called Sharia law. That is called Sharia. And by the way, Sharia law, I don't really quite understand the combination of the two terms. I understand why the MSA taught, I'm not criticizing the MSA, but I'm just saying that in English or in America or in popular discourse or in the media, the fact that these two words are combined together is really, it's irrational, it's almost somewhat redundant. Because law is a part of the Sharia, but not the entirety of it. And there is no such thing as Sharia law. There's no such thing as Sharia law. Not from a Muslim perspective, there's not. And so, it's a combination of these two forces. Now, what does the Sharia encompass? What is included within the scope of Sharia? What does Sharia speak about or speak to? So Sharia, there are 5, I will talk about the objectives of Sharia in a second. That's a very popular discussion that I'll get to in just a second. But where does Sharia apply? I want to talk about the application of it, because I think that's where the misunderstanding is occurring. The application of Sharia has 5 places. 5 areas of life in which the Sharia would apply. Number 1 is what we call al-imaniyat or al-i'tiqadat, and that basically means beliefs. What an individual, what a person believes, the iman, the faith. And that is exactly what it says that it is. What a person chooses to believe. Does a person believe in one God? As Muslims, we believe in one God. We believe there are prophets of God. We believe there are angels. We believe that there were sacred scriptures that were sent down by God. We believe in an afterlife. We believe in death. We believe in life after death. And we believe in dealing with the consequences of our choices in this life, in that life after death. And that is our belief system. And that is the first and foremost application or applied area of Shariah. The second area where Shariah applies is worship. Al-ibadat. And by extension, the Muslim concept of worship, a lot of what we could call purification, cleanliness, and that's got another area where it kind of overlaps into as well. But worship, how a person worships, where they worship, how they worship, who they worship, prayer basically. And the different manifestations of that worship. Whether it is you see a Muslim in a corner praying, facing towards the direction of Mecca and they're praying, or whether a Muslim is fasting for 30 days in the month of Ramadan, or whether a Muslim is undertaking a journey halfway across the world to go and visit the sacred house of God, make the pilgrimage, go to the city of Mecca and perform the rites of the pilgrimage, the Hajj over there. This is worship. And Sharia addresses the area of worship, and it applies within worship. The third area of one's life where Islam speaks to, and that is a realization or a manifestation of the Sharia, would be mu'amalat, business dealings, interactions, transactions. When officially dealing with one another, monetarily, financially dealing with each other. Sharia speaks to that. And how does it end up speaking to that? And this is where it starts to become a little bit more, it gets to the point, to the root of the matter, or maybe the cause of the confusion. There are two things. Number one, it does provide technicalities. It does have certain do's and don'ts that some folks might not like. For instance, it talks about how usury and interest, which is actually one and the same from the Islamic perspective. The Muslim tradition does not separate these two terms from one another. And this country did not separate those two terms from one another until a lot later on. But usury or interest, which is the one and the same for us, is something that Islam prohibits us from engaging in, from actively taking a part in. Because it sees these as advantageous to those people who already are prospering. And these are tools. It sees, Islam basically provides a perspective that these are financial tools to exploit those who are already struggling in any given society, in any given economic system. So that could be a place of contention now. However, at the same time, we also have instruction on how to realize this within our everyday lives. This is not the first time throughout Muslim history that Muslims have been a minority. This is not the first time. So all of this has been hashed out and has been covered and has been discussed. And we are basically told, and that's why if you go to anyone who is an expert of Sharia, a scholar, a religious scholar, and you talk to them and a Muslim goes to them to basically get advice saying, look, I know interest is something we as Muslims should not engage in. However, at the same time, in these circumstances, as a citizen of this country, it is unavoidable for me. I'll give you an example of this. Insurance, in its essence, especially the way the industry operates today, insurance in its essence is a form of usury based on the Islamic and the Muslim definition of usury and interest. It is a manifestation of that. And for that simple reason, in its essence, insurance is something that would not be permissible for a Muslim. So it's something that a Muslim would not actively, willingly engage in. But if someone was to come to a qualified Islamic scholar, a person of knowledge, and say, I am a citizen of the United States of America. In order for me to drive a car, I have to have liability insurance on my vehicle. I have to have insurance, otherwise I'm legally not allowed to drive. The instruction to that individual in that situation would be, you sign up and you get insurance. If it leads to unavoidable harm, for instance, again, in this country, You know, the cost of medical attention is very, very, it's crippling. Healthcare is crippling, the cost of it. And so if someone was to inquire that, well, again, as a citizen of this country, as a member of this society, the way that the health industry operates, I would not be able to live my life and just foot the bill every single time I had a medical expense. So what do I do in that situation? So the instruction to that person would be, sign up for health insurance. And so, yes, in financial dealings, Islam has rules and regulations. But they take into consideration the social context and the conditions within which a person lives. It takes all of that into consideration, which, by the way, as a little bit of a side note, you know, the strictness, if that's what you want to view it as, in terms of usury or interest, I think anybody who has been alive and awake for the last 4 years in the United States of America should have absolutely no problem with that. We've seen exactly what happened here in this country. And how terrible the consequences of that have been, how crippling it has been, and how probably for the rest of our lives we're going to be living out the consequences of those choices that were made. And so it shouldn't be a surprise. The fact that I explained what I explained about the insurance industry. I mean, if there's anybody in here in this room that sells insurance for a living, I apologize. But it is an industry that, I'm not speaking to the individuals who maybe work in that industry, but it is an industry that operates based off of the premise of preying and feeding on people. And so you have to be able to recognize and identify some of these factors. Nevertheless, there's a second area within how Islam and Sharia applies and manifests itself within financial dealings, and that is in terms of the ethics. The ethics of it, morality and ethics. And that is a big part of it, that Islam, there is no concept within, from a Muslim's perspective, of business being business. Business is business. Business is cutthroat. You do what you got to do. Looking out for number one, trying to get ahead. What other type of cliche or figure of speech you can think of? That from an Islamic perspective, that is not okay for us. And I wanted to share with you, people talk about Sharia, let's talk about some of the manifestations of Sharia and how that will apply in our current day. You know, right now as we speak, again, we are witnessing, even this generation has had the misfortune of witnessing war and the consequences of war. We see in Syria, there are tens of thousands of those citizens. I am shocked sometimes. I don't understand how in the world that we live in today, in our civilized, modern world, how you can wake up one morning, and we were talking with some of the guys over here and some of the girls, that you can wake up in the morning and check your Twitter feed and you find out that 500 people were massacred in one village in one town last night while we were sound asleep. Like, how is that still going on in the world that we live in? You know, recently and this might be a sore subject for some, I'm not speaking to the politics of it. I'm just talking about the loss of life and how tragic the loss of life is. You know, the bombing that's going on right now in Gaza, that just started up a day or two ago. That just the pure loss of life and how tragic that is. You know, and a lot of times we don't realize. I was looking at this morning, I was playing with my kids, I was just talking to them and just playing with them, and I looked at my kids, and you know, anybody who's a parent, when you look at your child, your heart just fills up with love. There's no feeling like looking at your children, especially when they're younger, before they start making trouble. But yeah, there's a lot of parents in here who pay college tuition, so they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But when they're 3 and they're 5, they're great to look at, right? So, and they say the most ridiculously cute stuff, right? So I'm just sitting there looking at my children, talking to them, listening to their sweet, beautiful voices. My heart is just filled with love, and I'm sitting there, but at the same time thinking, there's a child as innocent and as beautiful as this child is to me, there's a child somewhere in this world right now, whether it be in Gaza, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Burma, there's a child somewhere right now who is being killed, who's being bombed, whose dead, burned, charred body is being lifted up and carried by that child's own father or mother. And the tears are falling on the child's dead body. That is going on in the world I live in. And part of Shariah is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he says in a narration, Naha Rasulullah, one of his companions, Imran bin Hussein, radiallahu anhu, may Allah be pleased with him, this is one of his students and his companions, he says that the Prophet and the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, he forbade us from selling weapons at a time of war. نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن بيع السلاح في الفتن. He said it is forbidden. He prohibited us that it is not allowed for someone to sell weaponry at a time of unrest, at a time of war and turbulence. It is not permissible. This is a part of our Sharia code. Part of our Sharia code, look at the world that we live in and how there is suffering, there is poverty in the world that we live in. In the modern, sophisticated, civilized world that we live in, there is poverty and starvation and suffering. That the Prophet of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, the Sharia says, Al-jalibu marzuqun wal-muhtakiru mal'unun. That somebody who goes and gathers food items, necessity, food, medicine, clothing, blankets, necessary needs of people. Somebody who goes and collects necessary items for people's survival and brings them to people who are suffering or in a time of suffering or in a place or a situation or a time of tragedy, then that person will be fed, will be blessed, will be taken care of by God, and all of the creation of God prays and wants good for that person. That is a part of Sharia. وَالْمُحْتَكِرُ مَلْعُونٌ. And someone who hoards, price gorges, price gouging. Somebody who hoards and price gouges necessary items like food and water, medication, at a time, at a place, in a situation where people are suffering, when Hurricane Sandy hits and people are left without water for a week, when Katrina happens and people have no water to drink even, that somebody who says, this is it, this is my time to make a buck, get rich quick, that I'm going to load up a truck full of bottled water that I bought for $1 a piece, and I'm going to go sell it there for $10 a pop. Make some money. That somebody who does that is cursed by God and cursed by the messenger of God and cursed by all the creation of God. That is a wretched, horrible, accursed human being. That's a part of our Sharia. That's something we believe in and that we hold firm to. And these are values that admittedly even maybe Muslims are not fully aware of. But this is exactly why we need to educate ourselves and we need to learn. The fourth place, and I'm going to kind of move this along quickly, the fourth place that Sharia manifests or it is applied to is within one's personal life, private personal affairs. That means my home, my family, my marriage, how I raise my kids, the choices I make, what I choose to eat, what I choose not to eat, what I choose to drink, what I choose not to drink, which is basically my business and nobody else's business. We were raised with the value of minding your own business. And that's really what it boils down to. So what somebody does in their own personal time, in their free time, what they like to eat or drink, what they prefer to watch or not watch on the television, that is a manifestation of Sharia, and Islam provides us guidance in regards to that. That's why we don't drink alcohol, we don't eat pork. That's why those who choose to follow another dietary restriction where meat needs to be processed or cut in a certain fashion or a certain way. That's why maybe there are some things that I don't like to watch, or I don't like to observe, or I don't choose to listen to. But then those are personal choices. And then the fifth and the final manifestation of the Sharia is in one's mannerisms. Character, conduct, manners. What we call akhlaq. How you walk and how you talk. How you treat people. And it guides us in that regard to the highest possible noble character. So this is kind of the manifestation of Sharia and how it manifests itself. So what do we basically end up realizing? What do we basically end up realizing? What we end up realizing is that the vast overwhelming majority of what Sharia addresses is just the daily, personal, practical, everyday life of any human being. That has no implications of government or governance or lawmaking or law enforcement. There is a very, very small, minor area of Sharia that does address governance and government and lawmaking and law enforcement. But what needs to be understood and said, and I know this was one of the points here in today's presentation, but what I basically wanted to say, we were listening from Dr. Bagby. I mean, Dr. Bagby would tell you he's been studying Islam for probably 30, 40 years. And he can imagine somebody studying a science, a discipline, a code of law for 30 years. I went overseas. I studied actually overseas for 10 years. And I continue to study for the last 10 years. And in 20 years, I'm just still exploring. I'm still learning. So obviously I won't be able to comprehensively touch on and explain everything, in this presentation, in this session, but I did want to touch on some key ideas and concepts to help dispel some of the misunderstandings. Now, there was a question in there about some of the governance. There are two points that I will make when we do talk about the governmental aspect of Sharia. There are two things I will talk about. The law part of Sharia, there are two things I'll say. Number one, it is not part of the Muslim tradition. It is not prescribed within the Quran. It is not found within the prophetic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that Muslims as a minority, existing as a minority, were ever instructed, were ever told to become a force of rebellion within their society as a minority, and to try to overthrow an established government in place and replace the legal system under which they live as a minority, to replace that system with an Islamic or a Sharia system. There is no precedent, no evidence establishing that fact. That for a minority that this is a goal. For a majority, yes, it is recommended that you try to implement Islam and Islam's code and Islam's solutions to your problems as much as possible, and I'm not going to shy away from that fact. But as a minority, because if the question is Islam in America, and that's the other clarification that I try to make as much as possible. Well, I was born and raised here in America. I live in America. I raise a family in America. This is the social context I'm familiar with. And so when I'm addressing Islam, I'm addressing it in terms of how it applies here. That in terms of the Muslims in America, there is no religious obligation based on precedent or evidence, and those are the two things our religion is based upon. There is no religious obligation to try to establish a Sharia system in America. There's no such thing. And anyone who claims otherwise needs to be asked for one of two things: evidence or precedent. And if they were to study the religion itself, they would actually find the contrary. Makkan Sira. Makkan Sira. As-Sira al-Makkiyah, Makkan Sira, which basically means the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the period of his prophethood in the city of Mecca is something that Muslims and non-Muslims alike need to study. Need to study. One of the tragedies of our time, even in the Muslim community, I was talking with a group of Muslim educators this past week. I was telling them that one of my teachers had actually imparted this wisdom to me, that one of the tragedies even within the Muslim community is that there became an obsession, a fascination with Medina and Sirah. The prophethood, the era of the Prophet in the city of Medina, before studying, without studying, the prophethood in the city of Mecca, the Meccan era of prophethood. That is a problem, because you do not have a complete picture in front of you. That the Meccan era is clear proof. You know, in the Meccan era there was never a promise. Read the Quran, study Meccan revelation, and you'll find that there was never a promise that there would be a majority community that would be established, as in the case of Medina. That promise was not made during the era of Mecca. As far as the Muslims was concerned, this was life. Not just a minority, but an oppressed minority. An oppressed minority. Muslims went, at the time of the Prophet, were deputed by him, so it was sanctioned and approved, and they were instructed by him to go and establish a minority community in East Africa, in Abyssinia. And they lived there as a minority under Christian rule. And never once were they given the instruction. Was it a part of their mandate to overthrow the government or to try to force their way or enforce a Sharia code within the society that they lived in? That was never a part of their mandate. Never, never, ever was. And so we realize from this, the point number one being that this is not a mandate of the Muslim community in America is to establish a Sharia code. That's not a part of our mandate. That's when that conversation that I had earlier about the goal and the objective, it comes back into play. That the goal and the objective is still very alive for us, and Sharia is still very alive for us, because it still governs me and how I walk and how I talk, how I raise my kids, how I'm raising and taking care of my family, how I conduct business, the ethics and the morality in terms of conducting business. It still governs, and how I worship. It still governs all of that. So Sharia is alive and well, but when it comes to the legal aspect of it, it is not a part of our mandate here as a minority community to actually establish and enforce this code of law upon the majority that we live amongst. That's point number one. The second point is there are questions and concerns about some of these specifics in the penal code in Sharia that seem inhumane or unjust or unfair. There are certain questions folks have. And usually the point of that, very honestly, I'm going to be very straightforward with you, a lot of the questions that come about women's rights and things like that, that's just due to a lack of education. It's just a lack of study, very honestly, of the actual sources. So I recommend you actually study the sources. But usually the focal point of this conversation is, the specific punishments that are to be given, in the case of intentional premeditated murder, or in the case of armed robbery, or in the case of adultery that is witnessed and established. One thing that needs to be understood, there are very severe punishments that are mentioned for this. But number one, there's a few things. Number one, it is very, very nuanced. It is a lot more nuanced than you've been told. And again, open and read the books and you'll find this to be as plain as day. It is a lot more nuanced. There are certain preconditions. There are certain things that have to be pre-existing. Number one, it must be a Muslim majority place that actually enforces across the board an Islamic code of ethics and law, the Sharia. Number two, that even what is taken into consideration, that what is the overall condition of that society? Is immorality rampant in that society? For instance, a lot of times people talk about, they want to cut off people's hands who steal. Well, it takes a lot of things into consideration. First of all, what is the level of poverty within that community? What are the economic circumstances within that society? Is there a welfare system in place? And then there are, if all of those things, which by the way, if you know a place like that in the world, please let me know, because I'd like to move there with my family. All right? We know the world that we live in. We know the world that we live in. There's people struggling, you don't have to drive very far. Even if you live in a nice little subdivision, drive 5 minutes away from your house and you'll find real struggle. You'll find real struggle, where sometimes people don't even have an opportunity. So it is, if there is fairness in that society, economic opportunity, a welfare system that provides the basic human needs of people in that area, disenfranchisement is little to none. Those are the pre-existing conditions. Then, if all of that is in place, then the second thing that is taken into consideration is then there are other things, other factors, other things that have to be in place, prerequisites. First of all, who is this person that was stealing it? Sound mind, sound emotionally, sound intellectually? Do they have some extenuating circumstances that have not been taken into consideration? Then, what were they exactly stealing? Were they stealing food? Were they stealing clothing, like basic clothing, like a blanket or a shirt to put on their back? If so, absolutely no punishment for this person, because we should have been taking care of that. Then there's no punishment in that situation. And let's just say it's none of this, and all these conditions are in place. Then what is the value of what they are stealing? It has to be a valuable item. Then it's not something that was left out in the open, or it was unguarded, or it's something that was exposed. It was something that was under lock and key. So basically it's like armed robbery. It's like breaking and entering. When all of these conditions are being met, then finally the end result and the end consequence, and there's absolutely no shred of a doubt that this is the person who actually stole it, then that punishment would be levied. This is the type of nuance. And even now I'm kind of cramming it together. So there's a lot of nuance even in these areas of discussion that have not been taken into consideration. And so when people outside of this nuance, without an eye or an attention to detail, are talking about these topics and issues, it literally results in, it is nothing more than propaganda at that point. It is the alienation of a minority in a society. What the factors or what the motives are of alienating a minority, there are different ones, there are different factors, and for some of them, honestly speaking, at some point, sometimes it is just illogical, irrational. I personally cannot wrap my head around it, but this is an intentional alienating of a minority. And we in our country, Dr. Bagby is a lot more knowledgeable and a lot more fitted to talk about this than I am, but in this country we have a history of the terrible things and the tragedies that can occur when you behave irresponsibly like this. When you alienate a minority, what can oftentimes be the consequence of that? It is very scary. It is very scary. And it is, the things that occur as a consequence of that are things that we would not even think were possible. We would not think that we were humanly capable and possible of doing this, but it has occurred. And history will repeat itself if we do not learn to rise above that, if we cannot be better than that. And so, basically, to conclude my presentation here, one of the things I wanted to very quickly present is Sharia aspires to 5 primary values. Sharia aspires to 5 primary values. Number 1, freedom of religion. I'm kind of rewording it, but the protection of people's faith and their right to worship, but freedom of religion. Number 2 is protection of life. One of the values is the sanctity of life. Number 3 is the ability to, the freedom to think, intellect, rational thought is the third quality, the third value. Number 4 is the protection of family. And number 5 is the protection of personal property. These are the 5 primary values that Sharia strives. Sharia is in place to basically accomplish these 5 goals. And I want you to think about the 5 that I basically just said and see to what extent we disagree with that. And the last thing in terms of, because something I touched on was Islamophobia, and the demonizing of Muslims and the alienation of the Muslim community. One of the last things I wanted to present here is, it's in today's world, let me put it this way, as a Muslim, to visit maybe Muslim majority parts of the world, Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, to some people there, because just as we are being misinformed here, there is misinformation there as well, no doubt. But it can be a shocking idea for someone to be proud to be an American and also proud to be Muslim as well. But that stems from a very, very specific place. I listed to you the objectives of the Sharia. Sit down and compare that. Put those 5 points in front of you as you read through the Constitution. List those 5 points down and place them in front of you as you read through the Bill of Rights. And then tell me about the similarities that you're able to draw between the two. One of the very interesting things that I was kind of reading through was that, and this is a point of major contention between people who argue about separation of church and state and things like that. This is disputed to quite an extent, but one of the very interesting things I was reading was the Treaty of Tripoli from 1796, or it was signed by the Americans actually in 1797. And Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli is something that is heavily disputed between these different groups that are kind of constantly debating back and forth about separation of church and state. But it's very profound and very interesting as to the foundations of even this country. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Muhammadan nation, any Muslim nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. This was between a Muslim majority country and a Christian majority country, that these were the terms of their relationship with one another. These were the founding fathers, the people who laid the foundation of this great country that we live in, that we are citizens of. Take into consideration that if there was a minority community or a minority population that were citizens of this country, that were as American as anybody else, then what would be the attitude of the government and its people and the citizens of that country towards their fellow citizens? In their vision, according to and their foundation on which this country is founded and based upon, what would they have said about the treatment of a religious minority who were citizens of this country? What would they have said about that? And so that's something for us all to think about as Americans. That when we hear hate speech and we hear hate talk and we hear xenophobia and Islamophobia, when we hear this type of xenophobic talk, we should be intelligent enough, thoughtful enough to take this into consideration and realize that that is un-American. That is as un-American as somebody overseas in another country talking against America. That is just as un-American. Because that was not the foundation or the vision with which this country was founded and built upon. And secondly, as Muslims, being American and keeping that in mind, we also need to go back and study Islam. I'm going to air a little bit of dirty laundry here. I'm just going to say it. All right? As Muslims, it is very, very sad how little we know and how uninformed we are about our own religion. I mean, I'm not going to ask anyone to raise hands because I'm not trying to put people on the spot, but ask yourself if you've ever read through the entire Quran cover to cover translation. As a Muslim, ask yourself that question. If you've ever read the entire translation of the Quran cover to cover, If you at least have enough basic Arabic knowledge to be able to understand what God is saying to you directly, have you put in that much time or effort and energy to learn that? Ask yourself as a Muslim, ask yourself, have you ever read the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, from cover to cover, from beginning to end? And in how much detail have you studied his life? How aware of you are you of Muslim history, of the Prophet's life, of the message of the book of God, the book of Allah, the Quran? And if the answer is a little disappointing, then it's really, really easy to understand why there's so much misinformation and miseducation and misunderstanding out there, because we who say this is our religion know so little about it that we don't even know what's right and wrong. So how are we expecting somebody else who does not practice this religion, does not claim this religion as their own? Why am I so upset with them when they are misinformed, when they misunderstand? So we really have to learn to be critical of ourselves, and if we want to improve our situation, then complaining is not enough. Complaining is not enough, but it's time we did something about it. Alhamdulillah, last weekend, one of our prominent leaders in the Muslim community in America, Imam Zaid Shakir, I was with him last weekend. We were having dinner together, and he always says this thing. He always tells Muslims, he says, Muslims don't get angry. He says, Muslims don't get angry, get even. And what he means by that is, do something about it. Oh, they're misinterpreting the Quran, they're mistranslating this, they're saying lies about the Prophet. Well, then correct it. What is the verse actually saying? What is the actual translation of the verse? What actually did the Prophet do in this situation? Then that's the problem. So it's about time that we did do something. It's about time that we learned. And it's not that difficult, it's not that hard, it just takes a little bit of effort. We're sitting here together sharing a space in an academic institution. This place is about learning. This place highlights the potential and the ability of people to learn and enlighten themselves and grow. And so let's be inspired by that. And let's continue to grow, and let's continue to learn, and let's improve ourselves, so that we not only improve ourselves as Muslims, not only as a Muslim community, but we improve ourselves as human beings and as citizens of this great country. And so that we can realize both the values and the principles of our religion and this country, and we can actually become a role model society for human beings worldwide. I pray and I hope God gives us the ability to practice everything that was said and heard. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum again. I would just like to thank Sheikh Abdul Nasser Jungda for that amazing speech. Now it's time for our question and answer session. We've gathered all the flashcards off the tables, but we have 2 microphones on either side of the room where you can come up and personally ask your question if you'd like to. To make that a little less complicated, if we could just have single file lines, and then we'll get to everyone's question. So now I'd like to invite our treasurer, Samir Nasser, Sheikh Abdul Nasser Jungda, and Dr. Bagby to the stage to get the questions started. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Samir Nasser, and as Iman said, I'm the treasurer for the UK MSA. We'll begin with a question on the note card that I have. The question is, how do you explain gender equality for women under Sharia law when women's rights in the Middle East are constantly oppressed?
No.
So one of the etiquettes that we learn as students is to always show respect to our senior scholarship and the more learned people. But there's a phrase in Arabic that says al-amru fawqa al-adab, that you try to show respect and etiquette to people older and more knowledgeable than you, but when they tell you to do something, you basically got to do it. So the question is about gender equality and women's rights in Islam. When we witness what we witness, maybe in the Middle East or in other parts of the world, where the majority of the people there are Muslim, then how do we reconcile that contradiction? Because that's essentially what it is. Part of the answer of that is, well, there's two things I'll say about that. Number one is we have to be able to differentiate Islam and its teachings in its proper form from the actions of people. It is unfortunate. I don't like giving this answer. That's why I'm kind of hesitating a little bit and I'm kind of stumbling here, because as somebody who primarily works within the Muslim community, as an educator in the Muslim community, it's sad that we actually give that answer. That, you know, we have to say, well, they don't really represent the teachings of Islam and their actions are not representative of what we believe and what we actually preach. But it's sad. And the Quran speaks about how sad it is that we don't practice what we preach. But nevertheless, that is the obvious answer to that. That is unfortunate. That is not correct. Not something we agree with. And not something that Islam espouses. But it is the unfortunate reality. Part of empathy, which is a prophetic quality and the quality of any decent human being, is also trying to understand where people come from, realizing we're not perfect here in this society, so why are we expecting anybody else anywhere else to be perfect either? So, you know, there are problems in any given society, and there are certain political, social, economic factors that a lot of those societies have dealt with. I mean, we've all, again, if you've been keeping up with the news for the last couple of years, we've been witnessing this revolution in the Middle East, the Arab Spring. And if you really study that, then you realize that, you know, a lot of these societies have lived under oppressive rule for not just the 40 years that this said dictator was in power, but for the last 200 years. They were colonized. These were flourishing, civilized societies. They were the pride of their era, and they had civilizations that were beautiful, were flourishing. They were colonized, they were occupied, they were oppressed. And after a long period of time, they climbed out from under that occupation, that colonization, only to result in dictatorship and more oppression and more tyranny. And so there are certain factors. I'm not making excuses. If a woman is being oppressed somewhere, she is being oppressed, and that is wrong. That has to be put an end to. But what I am saying is that as groups, we have a bad habit. It's a human problem to judge people. That we have to take a lot of different factors into consideration. But the bottom line is that they do not represent the actions of Islam. Secondly, second part of that answer is also that there's a different reality to be witnessed when you interact with common people in an actual place, when you travel to a place, when you're, like, let me just put it this way. I've actually traveled around the world. You would be shocked. It is bizarre how people perceive America and American people. Like, you would be shocked at the assumptions people have about us. Like, just bizarre. Like you'd want to slap them and say, where'd you get that from? That's ridiculous. Like, seriously? That's what you think? Like, yeah. Like, let me put it this way. Everybody in the Middle East thinks all of America is like the Jersey Shore, all right? Pretty much, all right? They think all of America is like the Jersey Shore. A lot of people didn't laugh. That means you haven't seen the Jersey Shore. Thank God Almighty, all right? It is a blessing of God that you have not seen the Jersey Shore. But everybody thinks that America's like a big old Jersey Shore, unfortunately. Which that'd be terrible. That'd be the worst place on earth, right? But that's not the reality. So same thing, what I'm basically trying to say is based off of what we're shown on media or what we've been told through a particular outlet, don't assume on behalf of everyone there might be a lot of different circumstances once you actually go there.
Okay. Hello? Hi. Okay, shukran, Sheikh. Okay, so the second and third question I'm going to combine. The first one is, I want to know the place for homosexuals in Islam. The second one is, there have been over 4,000 executions of gays and lesbians in Iran since the revolution in 1979. Does this comply with Shariah? How about the many executions in other Sharia states such as Saudi Arabia, where there were over 300 executions last year?
I guess I can't get out of this one. Huh? The Islamic teaching And when we say Islamic teaching, we're talking about the two main sources, the texts of Quran and the reports, the traditions of Muhammad. May God's peace and blessings be upon him. These two sources make clear that homosexuality is not allowed in Islam. It is not considered a natural way of life. It is considered a sin, and it is the sin of Lot, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, a society that was punished because of their embrace of homosexuality. So that's the basic teaching. In classical Islamic law, so in other words, the understanding of Islamic law in classical times, and what I mean by classical times is basically Islamic civilization from the time of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, up until kind of the modern era, that homosexuals who were caught in the act, and of course Sheikh Abdul Nasser didn't go into all of the details, but to be punished for adultery or for homosexuality, you have to be caught in the act by 4 witnesses. So 4 witnesses have to actually witness the act. But the punishment for some scholars, not consensus, all scholars agree, was execution. Now, maybe people in Iran, they follow that. I don't know. In fact, I didn't know that. I didn't know that myself. But I mean, this is an issue, an ongoing issue that Muslims have in Muslim majority countries, is how they deal with these questions. And Sheikh Abdul Nasser said Sharia is aql also. Humans have to apply their understanding with the context in which, the historical context they live in, and to ultimately decide how to apply it. And the other aspect is people as a society have to do that. So society has to decide, well, how is it that we're going to implement the law? Because the law has to be implemented as society, not as an individual. No individual can say, I caught you, and therefore I'm going to punish you. There's no such a thing. It has to be as a society, as a system of justice. Sharia does not call upon the justice of one person, the judge, somebody being the judge and jury of any act. No, it has to be as a society. So the society has to decide, okay, what are the rules we're going to follow? So every era and every country really has to decide, let's look at Sharia, let's understand how we want to apply it. Maybe in Iran they've decided this is how we're going to apply it. And that's the decision. Other countries do other things. But of course, that has nothing to do with us in America, because we have no authority to do any of that. There are, as Sheikh Abdul Nasser made clear, questions of punishment or anything like that cannot be applied when Muslims have no authority in the land. So, I mean, those questions are mute for us, other than the fact that as Muslims we oppose homosexuality.
All right, thank you. Hamza has a question over there. Somebody, please ask.
Mountaintop removal for coal for corporations, and all around the world, the environment is slowly but quickly actually deteriorating. In your opinion, what do you think Sharia law will do for the environment and for the earth as a whole?
So, understanding what Sharia law really talks about and what it addresses, and understanding, it's like musical microphone. So it's, understanding that Sharia law doesn't necessarily mean like some new code of law that we're planning on or that we would end up instituting here, but Islam and its teachings, what it advocates, what it says about the environment. And again, looking back at Muslim majority countries is not going to be a great example of that. But generally speaking, what Islam has to say about the environment is it's actually a very, very important issue. There are so many different topics within it. One thing, first and foremost, from a faith-based perspective, the Quran, when it introduces us to God, when it tells us about who Allah is, it introduces us to Him through His creation. So the basic, especially the early revelation within the Quran, it says, look at the sky, look at the sun, look at the moon, look at the stars, look at the ocean, the trees, the earth, the animals. You know, it tells us, look at all these different things and marvel at how beautiful, remarkable, unique all of this is, and then realize that there is a creator who created all of this. So when you really think about it, for us, you know, literally all the creation of God, the environment in the Quran is referred to as ayat. These are signs of God. So as we continue to destroy the world that we live in, as a Muslim, it's very discerning, because we are destroying the signs of God. That's one thing. The other thing is, then there is specific advice within the Quran and within the prophetic tradition, such as, you know, wastefulness, overindulgence, electricity conservation, energy conservation. Energy conservation. The Prophet of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, in a narration in a prophetic tradition, he actually talks about, he instructed the companions, the Muslims, to put out the lantern before you go to bed. Don't leave a lantern burning while you go to sleep. Why? Because why is it on? Right? I mean, what's the point of it being on? Conserving energy. Don't unnecessarily, you're going to leave the lantern on, you're burning, you know, oil, or you're burning kerosene, or you're burning fuel all night long. 6 hours, 8 hours, you didn't need to. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, talked about going to sleep, praying the Isha prayer, the night prayer, once it officially becomes dark outside, and not socializing unnecessarily after that. It's like one of the ethics that he told us. Think about what's one of the wisdoms in that, so that you're not wasting energy. Like, everybody go to sleep now, right? Turn off the lights, let's go to sleep. I mean, just think about that. And then there are so many other specifics when it comes to, you know, preserving the environment, taking care of energy, harming unnecessarily plant life, trees. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would be very upset with people when they would harm plant life. Even animal rights were an issue. Now I'd be like, aren't y'all like the people that be like cutting like animals and stuff? No, it's a very holistic philosophy. It's a very holistic philosophy where we do consume animals, but not without need, necessity. The prophetic practice, and Muslims need to kind of hear this, the prophetic practice was to eat meat probably once every couple of weeks. And even well-to-do Muslims in the early few generations said eating meat more than once a week was excessive. Go and visit a meat like a meat processing plant. It is the scariest place on earth. Saw ain't got nothing on like a meat processing plant. It is scary. It is terrifying. It is barbaric. It is disgusting. It is disgusting. And so that's overindulgence. That's over consuming. So all these different ethics and morals are in place that address those issues.
Thank you, Sheikh. We have another open question.
Hello. My name's Admin Husick. I'm a junior here at the university. And first, I'd like to thank you guys for coming to speak. And I've got one question for Dr. Bagby and the other for our guest speaker. The first one for Dr. Bagby, speaking on the first two steps of a culture being integrated into a society, would you prefer the invisibility of Islam in the U.S. over the attrition and negative recognition it has undergone over the past decade? So do you think that, so pretty much would you prefer the first step where the Islam in the United States is invisible, would you prefer that to the negative recognition and perception that it currently has?
Well, it's like somebody growing up. You have to go through those teenage years, right? But you grow up and you become mature. So it's one, inevitable, and two, it's the right thing. It's the right thing that Muslims expect and demand a seat at the table, that they be recognized as being part and parcel of this country and not marginalized, excluded, ignored. So yes, the answer, a simple answer is invisibility is not desirable. Being accepted as a full member of this society, having a place at the table is desirable.
All right, thank you. And the second question for our guest speaker. You mentioned about a thief stealing, and my question is, even if a thief knowingly steals money or jewelry or any other valuable possession for his own gain, is he really deserving of physical harm? And does that punishment seem harsh and outdated, considering there are more modern remedial ways to punish somebody that might steal?
That's a very good question, there's a lot of different things to take into consideration. One thing I would definitely say is, again, I want to kind of reiterate that there's a lot of pre-existing conditions and a lot of requirements that have to be met in order for that punishment to finally, that person to basically be fitting for that type of punishment. But even in that case, given all of that, all those preconditions, your question is, does that still really seem fair at the end of the day? One of the very interesting things is that these types of punishments are meant to be deterrents. And just the known fact that they exist, or maybe even a couple of unfortunate souls suffering through something like that, is meant to be a deterrent, and kind of cleanse society from those ills and those problems. And one thing I do have to comment on, I do have to say is, a lot of times we might see other forms of punishment that are prevalent in the Western world or the modern world that might seem like better alternatives, but are they truly better alternatives? Those are questions we have to seriously ask ourselves, because I don't think that we are critical and contemplative and introspective as a society as we need to be. When we look at the industry of incarceration in this country, that how it is a full-fledged industry, we look at how it is an alienation of that entire population, how they are removed from or excluded from basic rights and basic treatment once they've undergone that experience, and how the system is almost geared in such a way, and society is built in such a way so that after somebody makes a mistake, they basically become a leper, social leper, for the rest of their life. So in either case, there are severe repercussions, and it's something that has to be reconsidered and reevaluated either way. But it is a very, very harsh punishment. But I would say two things to that. Number one is that there are a lot of preconditions that have to exist before that is even possible. Number two, in and of itself, it's meant to serve more so as a deterrent, rather than an actual punishment that there's like an assembly line. People are just being put through the grinder. It's meant to be more of a deterrent.
All right, thank you.
My pleasure.
We have one more open question. Please ask.
Good evening. My question is, you all mentioned that Sharia law is from the Quran and the other prophetic meanings. My question is, I've heard a term called law of abrogation, and I'm wondering how
what was that word again?
Law of abrogation.
Abrogation.
And I'm questioning how that impacts your view on Sharia law and how Sharia law is implemented with that in place. And if you could explain what that actually means.
Well, the Quran itself says that there are certain laws that in earlier times in the life of the Muhammad were abrogated for new laws. So, for instance, in the very beginning, drinking of wine was not prohibited. It was, in fact, allowed. You weren't supposed to come to prayer drunk, though, right? And then later, it was prohibited. So at one point, so it's kind of an evolution. But the first, in a sense, rule is abrogated, and the later rule is there. And the jurists and scholars of Islam have discussed this at no end. There are not a lot of examples of abrogation, but it is there.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, I have written the notes, but I just want to bring up my question here, okay?
Okay.
I just want to first a yes or no answer. I think, are you trying to bring the blasphemy law to the United States? Because think back of just months ago or 2 months ago, the Muhammad movie, which caused rioting and killing all over the world. And I see Muslims holding those posters saying, behead all those who insult Muhammad. Okay, this is my first question. Are you trying to bring the blasphemy law to the United States? Like what they did in Pakistan or Saudi? Okay. My second question is, I go and read the hadith and I watched the movie trailer. I found that, well, the movie is a stupid one, but it's not a low quality. But the main purpose of the movie is trying to portray Muhammad as a womanizer, as a looter, or as a warlord. Okay? But when I read the hadith, I indeed find some of the facts about Muhammad very disturbing. Okay? It's from Sahih Bukhari. And I can name the index. Let's say, well, some children are here, but let's say, the Prophet used to go around and have sex relations with all of his wives in one night, and he had 9 wives in that time. Okay? Is this a womanizer? You hear a womanizer? This is from your sources. This is from Sahih Bukhari. And the index is 5068. This is just one example. I have many other examples.
Okay.
Okay.
So the answer to the first question about the blasphemy laws, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, no. That's not a goal, that's not an objective, no. As far as the facts that you're finding confusing, there are 2 things I'll tell you. Number 1, I would recommend that you read, you have to understand that a legal text or a reference source is very different than a biography. It's different. Sahih Bukhari is a hadith source and a reference. What that means is it's a reference for legal materials and legal analysis. Without proper training and understanding and background, you won't even understand what you're reading, what the context of it is. You won't know any of that. What I do recommend, if you want to know about the Prophet Muhammad, is you read a biography.
I know the Seerah, right? It's called
the Seerah, right. And read a biography written by a non-Muslim. If it bothers you, read a biography written by a non-Muslim, but read a Seerah.
I read your sources. That's more trusted. Right?
Well, good for you. All right. So, but either way, read a Seerah rather than a hadith book, because they're 2 different elements. And then to specifically address the narration that you mentioned, and I'm personally going to apologize to you because of that narration. Why? That is a mistranslation.
Okay, but I found it online and I found several edits.
Right. And that's part of the problem, see, and this is why I kind of challenge challenged the Muslim folks that are here in the audience toward the end of my presentation. You know, we have a problem, and part of that problem is we're not educated, we're not well read, and we have not contributed to the Islamic resources that are out there. One of my ongoing projects and efforts that I'm involved in, there are two projects I'm involved in. Number one, I'm going through the entire Quran, chapter by chapter, not just translating it, but providing an in-depth English explanation to it, so that is there in proper English, translated by somebody who understands the Arabic and the English language. I'm also going through documenting the seerah, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And so that narration, the Arabic of it is, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يطوف على أهل بيته في ليل. That the Prophet of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, used to go and visit all of his family members in one night. What that means is that the different homes, he used to stop by and check on them. If you read the Arabic, and if you study Arabic, and I'm not saying this as a Muslim, I'm saying this as somebody who learned and studied Arabic academically, objectively. الطواف على البيت أو الطواف على أهل البيت means to literally visit people. For instance, in classical Arabic, that same figure of speech, that same expression is used about cats. Cats are called tawafina ala al-buyuti wa tawafat. That cats, they kind of wander about the neighborhood. You know, like there's our neighbor's cat is like all the time in my backyard, and so my girls, they freak out every single time the cat comes. So you know how cats just kind of roam around the neighborhood? So what is said about that is that's an expression in the Arabic language when you just kind of casually take a stroll. It's an expression in the Arabic language. So that narration says that the Prophet used to take a stroll through the neighborhood and stop by and check on family members. But it does not literally speak about intimate relations at all. It does not.
Well, I have checked even my mother tongue. I am a Chinese. I have checked the Chinese translation. It's still saying the same thing. So I hope one day you can provide us with
absolutely
trusted.
No, and I appreciate you doing some reading and asking intelligent questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any more, Hamza?
Yes.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Brother Nasser, thank you very much for such a wonderful narration of the Shariah. I will quote a verse from Matthew, which I read about 30 years ago. I went to a Christian school. It was, judge not, you shall not be judged. Condemn not, you shall not be condemned. And forgive, you shall be forgiven. Is Matthew 17. Then we have a constitution which says freedom of religion. On one hand, there's a Bible. I studied it for 17 years. And there was a point I knew about Bible more than a Christian. I went to a Catholic school for 10 years. So on one hand, there's a verse of Bible which I believe is real Bible, judge not. And on the other hand, there's the Constitution of the United States of America, and I have been citizen for 17 years. They are both violated and ignored when it comes to a minority religion in this country. We are being judged, and there's no freedom of speech. What is your take on that?
I mean, my personal take on that as an American, before, you know, just even from an American perspective, or as a human being, I find that appalling. I find that unfortunate, and I don't think it's correct. I don't think it's right. I probably would ask Dr. Bagby to maybe talk about the history of, you know, this issue and discrimination, and there have been other minorities. I mean, and it's...
I would like to add, sorry to interrupt, when it comes to a racial profiling for another colored person, I am a colored too, we have a freedom of speech, we have racial profiling and everything. When it comes to Islam as a minority in America, all the rules are violated. Freedom of speech is violated. Bible is violated. So what would be your take on that?
I mean, I think it's incorrect. It's not right. I do think it's important for us to not succumb to a victim mentality, but try to better the situation and better and raise the discourse and try to strive to aspire to higher values. But it is an unfortunate reality, and I mean the truth of the matter is we're not just the only minority that this goes on with. This is a human problem, and to just be very honest and not beat around the bush about it. In majority Muslim countries, there's persecution of minorities, racial, ethnic, or even religious minorities. There's great prejudice against them in all parts of the world. So this seems to be a human problem, and we hope that through education, through enlightenment, through spirituality, we can rise above this type of human problem, and we can actually rise to what we were meant to be.
It's hard to imagine somebody who abuses somebody in their family in the name of Sharia. It's because it's contradictory to Sharia. Either it's willing disobedience or ignorance, one of the two. Because in any Islamic family, there can be absolutely no what we might consider abuse, whether psychologically or physical abuse. So it's not Sharia or Islam that motivates, it's the kind of human weaknesses that we have. It is our personality that leads men and women to abuse one another. If they really follow the example of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and the example and the teachings of Quran, they would not engage in any form of abuse.
Okay, that's it for the questions.
And thank you guys, everyone, for coming. It was a great event. Please give a round of applause to our great speakers, Dr. Hassan Bagby and Sheikh Abdul Nasser Bangla. Thank you, everybody, for coming.